Hello dear students, I welcome you to this next lecture on subject of animal ecology. So in the previous first chapter you have studied introduction of ecology, you have studied study of ecology, its history, branches and scope, followed by concept of environment, population, community, ecosystem, biosphere and divisions of ecology like hot ecology and scene ecology. So in this second chapter is dedicated to ecosystem. So the lecture 1 of this chapter 2 is ecosystem structure and function. I am Amol Handore, assistant professor working at the Department of Zoology, KTHM College, Nasik. So in previous lecture you have studied the concept of biosphere and divisions of ecology, that is hot ecology and scene ecology. In today's lecture, the study objective will be introduction to ecosystem, overview of the different types of ecosystem, components of ecosystem, and structure of ecosystem, which comprises of two factors, that is biotic or living factors and abiotic or non-living factors. So let's start with today's topic, introduction to ecosystem. So we know that no organism can exist on itself without the environment. So all organisms are dependent on their environment for their basic needs. So living organisms are referred to as biotic components, and their non-living environment is the abiotic component of the environment, which are totally interdependent upon each other and they interact with each other such a way that these biotic and abiotic components cannot be separated from each other. Now, ecosystem is said to be the functional unit of ecology, and there occurs continuous interaction between the living and non-living components of the ecosystem. Now, this terminology, ecosystem, was coined by scientist A.G. Tansley in the year 1935. He was basically an ecologist, and in this ecosystem word, eco means environment and system means a interdependent complex, because there is a continuous interaction between living and non-living components of the environment. So the first definition of ecosystem was given by Tansley. According to him, ecosystem is a system resulting from integration of all the living and non-living factors of the environment. So he only concluded that all the living and non-living factors together they integrate to form what is called as ecosystem. Later on, this definition of ecosystem was revised. So there are two definitions which are now most commonly used. So the first definition of ecosystem is the living community of plants and animals in any area together with non-living components of the environment such as soil, air, water constitutes the ecosystem. Okay, so not only the plants and animals but their non-living components like soil, air, water, etc. constitute the ecosystem. The second definition of ecosystem is like that. Ecosystem is group of biotic communities of species interacting with one another as well as with the non-living environment, and there is continuous exchange of energy and matter. Okay, so we will be studying this flow of energy in ecosystem in next chapter, or rather next lecture, where we will understand that these living and non-living components, they are not separate but there is continuous exchange of energy and matter taking place. Now let's study or take an overview of types of ecosystem. So basically the ecosystems are divided into two basic types, that is natural ecosystem and artificial ecosystem. Further, this natural ecosystem can be divided into terrestrial ecosystem, that is land ecosystem, and aquatic ecosystem. So aquatic ecosystem is further divided into two major types, that is freshwater ecosystem and marine ecosystem. So we know that marine water where the salinity is higher and freshwater salinity is absent. Freshwater ecosystems are also further divided into two types, that is lentic and lotic. So lentic means standing water, whereas lotic means the flowing water ecosystem. So we will see some example in next slide. So the first basic type is natural ecosystem. So these ecosystems are naturally created. There is no interference of the human beings. They are naturally present. So examples of this natural ecosystem is like terrestrial ecosystem. You have forest, grasslands, or deserts. These are the type of natural ecosystem. And aquatic ecosystem can be freshwater. Here we have seen there are two types, lotic and lentic. Lotic means running water, for example streams, rivers, springs, and when the water is standing it is called as lentic ecosystem, for example lake, ponds and pools. Other type of aquatic ecosystem is marine water. So here examples are oceans and deep seas. Also you have estuaries. What is meant by estuary? Where you have the brackish water, where the river meets with the sea. That particular area is called as estuary. The second type of ecosystem is artificial or man-made ecosystem, also referred to as man-engineered ecosystem. So these are artificially created by human beings. So there is control or manipulation by the human beings. These are not naturally present. So a common example is cropland ecosystem, that is an agricultural field which is planted by human beings. So this becomes a artificial ecosystem. So for this there is needs of additional energy and planning, as well as resources are required which are used by the human beings. Okay, now let's come to the next part of today's discussion, components of an ecosystem. So through this chart we will understand the basic component of ecosystem. So there are two basic components, abiotic and biotic. So as the word tells us, abiotic means non-living and biotic means living. So let's first see the biotic or the living component can be of following types: producers, consumers and decomposers. So producers are also called as autotrophs. So what are these producers and all we will study in the next slide. Consumers are called as heterotrophs. So we know that autotrophs means they can produce their own food. Heterotrophs are dependent on the autotrophs because they cannot produce their own food. So for example, all the plants are the producers and the herbivorous animals which are feeding on these producers are called as heterotrophs. Further, these heterotrophs can be of four types, that is primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers and quaternary consumers. And there is another category that is called as decomposers or saprotrophs. So we will be studying them in detail in the next few slides, so I will not explain here. In abiotic components, all the non-living components which are required for these biotic species for their survival. So these abiotic components can be further divided into two subtypes, climatic factors and edaphic factors. So climatic factors can be like rain, light, wind, temperature. These are the climatic factors. whereas the edaphic factors includes the other parameters like soil, pH of the soil, minerals, topography of that land, how is the terrain of that particular land. All these are the edaphic factors. So let's begin with abiotic factors, or the non-living components of an ecosystem. So in a structure of ecosystem, you have the abiotic components. These are also known as abiotic factors or non-living factors. Now they have a very great influence on the living organisms, because without them living organisms cannot survive. So they are dependent on the abiotic component, and these are called as limiting factors because they are deciding the population of organisms of different species. Abiotic factors can be divided into three categories. So what are these three categories? Physical factors or climatic factors. It includes air, water, soil, temperature, light. Light can be in terms of duration as well as intensity of light. Then moisture, which can be measured in the terms of relative humidity, and pH. So all these are the physical factors of the environment. You have inorganic substances like carbon, nitrogen, sulfur, and phosphorus, which may be present in the soil. So this becomes the inorganic substances, or not only soil, this can be present in air as well. And third component or category is organic substances. The organic substances which have carbon in their backbone. So these includes proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, and other humus containing substances. So this is all about the basic introduction to abiotic component. Now let's go to study the biotic components of an ecosystem. So the biotic components, also referred to as biotic factors. So all the living things which are present in an ecosystem are called as biotic factors, and they are continuously interacting with the non-living factors for their survival. Okay, so now these biotic components can be of various types. So let's study their different types of the biotic factors. So the first category is producers, which are also called as autotrophs or self-feeders. Second category is consumers. These consumers are of further four types. Primary consumers are called as herbivores. Secondary consumers are called as carnivores. You have tertiary consumers, which are also carnivores, and you have quaternary consumers, which are also carnivores. So let's study each one by one. So the first category that we are going to study are called as primary consumers. So these primary consumers are nothing but the green plants. So let's study the first category, that is producers, which are also called as autotrophs or self-feeders. Why they are called as autotrophs or self-feeders? Because they are capable of producing their own food. So they are basically all the green plants which have chlorophyll pigment in them. So with the help of this chlorophyll pigment, they can capture the sunlight, and using this sunlight or photon, they can make their own food in the form of carbohydrate like glucose. This process is called as photosynthesis. So they are known as photoautotrophs. So photo means light, auto means self, and trophy means food. So they produce their own food with the help of light, and they are the sources of the basic food in an ecosystem. So the first food that is generated in an ecosystem is through the producers. So they are very important in an ecosystem. So there are different types of producers on land. If we see the terrestrial land, so you have the green plants are the producers. If we go into the freshwater or marine ecosystem, you do not find the trees or plants, but you will have algae and some aquatic plants. Okay, so these are the producers in freshwater ecosystem. In open water ecosystem, the dominant producer are the phytoplanktons. So phytoplanktons are the producers in the open water ecosystem. Sometimes even some microorganisms have the capacity to produce their or carry out this process to make their own food by a mechanism that is called as chemosynthesis. So such bacteria or microorganisms which are called as chemoautotrophs, they are also the producers. This is all about producers. Now we move to the second category, that is primary consumers. Now primary consumers means the herbivores which are feeding onto the producers. So these are those animals which are feeding onto the plants. So we know that such animals we call them as herbivores because they directly feed onto the producers, and hence they are called as primary consumers. So for example, rabbit, insect, deers, cow, all these are the herbivorous animals which feed onto the producers, that is plants. Okay, so that's why they are called as primary consumers. Now we move on to the third category, that is secondary consumers, which are also called as carnivores. Now carnivores means they are the flesh eaters or the meat eaters. So they eat on the other animals. Now what are these other animals? These are basically the herbivores. So they feed on the herbivores. So all those animals which are feeding on herbivores are called as secondary consumers. So they are also always carnivorous animals. You do not find any herbivore in secondary consumers, and they feed upon the primary consumers or the herbivores. Examples of secondary consumers are frogs, sparrow, snakes, and foxes. So these are just few examples of the secondary consumers which feed onto the primary consumers. So for example, sparrows, they feed on the uh, any millets or rice which is produced from the tree, the plants. So that's why they are called as. Or sometimes these sparrows feed onto the small insects which are nothing but the primary consumers. So that's why they are also referred to as secondary consumers. Okay, now we move to the next category, that is tertiary consumers. So tertiary consumers will feed on the secondary consumers. So these are the large animals which feed on the secondary consumer. So for example, wolf, jackal, leopard. So these are the larger carnivores which can kill the secondary consumers and they feed onto them. So such animals are called as tertiary consumers. And the last category is quaternary consumers. Now these are the largest animals or these are the largest carnivores. Carnivores, we know that carnivores means those which feed on the other animals. And so these quaternary consumers feed on to the tertiary consumers. So these are the top predators. That means no one can kill a quaternary consumer. So they are top in the food chain or in the food pyramid. So they are not eaten by any other animals. So example includes lion, tiger, eagle. So these are at the top of the pyramid. So these are called as quaternary consumers which feed onto these tertiary consumers. Now we move on to the last category, that is detrivores. Detrivores are also called as detritus feeders or saprophyte or saprotrophs. Now very simple, that any animal when it dies, you must have seen after some time the dead body of any animal is disintegrated. So it is done by these detrivores. So they feed on to the parts of the dead organism or whatever organic waste is present of the living organisms is decomposed by these detrivores. So these includes beetles, termites, ants, crabs, earthworms, as well as other microorganisms and fungi. Okay, so even the fungi, they are the major detrivores or saprophytes. So they play a very important role, that the ecosystem is maintained clean. All the dead organisms are broken down by these detrivores. Also, if we see the mechanism, they derive their nutrition. Why they are breaking down the dead bodies? Because they get their food by breaking down the complex organic molecule to simple organic compounds, and in this process they are getting food, and at the same time these organic compounds are again returned to the ecosystem. So various bacteria and fungi are the major detrivores or decomposers. So they do this by breaking down the dead organic material, and all the inorganic compounds are returned to the soil. So they play a very important role, the recycling of the nutrients. Okay, so we know that the body of organisms is made up of carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and those or these macromolecules, these are broken down by these decomposers. So the simple nutrients are returned back in the form of nutrients to the again to the ecosystem, and the producers like trees will get these nutrients in the soil, and they will again flourish. The last part of today's lecture, we'll see the basic functions of ecosystem. So the major functions of ecosystem is food chain, food web, and trophic structure. We are going to study this in next coming lecture. Energy flow of ecosystem, cycling of the nutrients, because various nutrients like carbon, phosphorus, sulfur, nitrogen, these are the elements which needs to be continuously cycled in the ecosystem. These are called as biogeochemical cycles. Then there is primary and secondary production, and finally you have ecosystem development and regulation. So these are the major functions of ecosystem. So we know that the ultimate source of energy for the ecosystem is sun. So the sunlight is utilized by the green plants, and through the process of photosynthesis and using the chlorophyll pigment, they produce the glucose, which is the food source, and that is stored, and that food is utilized by the herbivores, which are killed by the primary consumers, which are eaten by the secondary consumers, which are further eaten by the tertiary, and ultimately which are killed by the quaternary consumers. So there is a continuous flow of energy as well as matter takes place in the ecosystem, and there is a continuous interaction taking place between the biotic and abiotic components of the ecosystem. So with this, we conclude today's lecture on ecosystem structure and function. Today we have understood the basic definitions of ecosystem, concept of ecosystem. Then we understood the different types of ecosystem like natural and artificial ecosystem, their subtypes. Then we studied the structure of ecosystem, In that we studied the biotic components, which are the living components, and abiotic means non-living components. In abiotic components, we have studied the different categories like organic elements or the inorganic components. And in biotic component or biotic factor, we studied what is meant by producer, then heterotrophs, or rather consumers. So these consumers are further of four types, that is primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer, and quaternary consumer. And in the last, we studied what is meant by the functions of the ecosystem. So with this we conclude today's lecture. Thank you for your patience here.